December 17th, 1944. Just past midnight, the frozen forests of Belgium were smothered beneath a heavy sky, where snow fell endlessly, muting every sound, swallowing every horizon. A single military truck moved through the storm, a dim shape of steel and determination cutting through the white wilderness. Its tires struggled for traction on the narrow roads of the Ardennes, each rotation a defiance against ice, fatigue, and fear. The headlights barely pierced the storm ahead, their pale glow trembling across the snowdrifts like ghostly fingers searching for a path. Inside the cab, the driver gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles had turned the color of bone. The wipers beat in slow, stubborn rhythm, fighting a losing battle against the blizzard. He was alone, or at least it felt that way. The map on the seat beside him was torn, soaked, and nearly useless now. The roads it described no longer existed as they once did. Some had been cratered by shells, others erased entirely by advancing or retreating armies. The road signs that might have guided him were twisted or gone, stripped bare by time, by fire, or by human hands. He did not know where he was. His unit didn't know either, and perhaps no one did anymore. Not here, not tonight, in this shifting maze of snow and silence, where even the front lines had become a question. But in the back of his truck was a cargo more precious than gold, thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline, the lifeblood of an army that was freezing, starving, and nearly out of options. This was not just fuel. This was survival. Fuel for the Shermans that guarded the retreating columns, for the trucks carrying the wounded, for the artillery that still tried to answer the thunder from the east. What this man, this ordinary soldier, could not yet know was that his wrong turn, this one small act of endurance, would become a thread in the tapestry of history. If he turned back now, if his engine failed, or if he was captured in the storm, then Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, might very well succeed. The German army, battered but unbroken, was making its final bid to split the Allied front, to force the West to its knees one last time. The fate of Europe might hinge on a single man lost in the snow. And yet, he kept driving. The truck roared, coughed, and roared again. Each mile he gained was an act of faith against impossible odds. What he carried would not just restart engines, it would reignite hope. This is the forgotten story of a man who was never meant to be a hero, a driver who went the wrong way, and brought the right thing to the right place at exactly the right moment. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Hitler's last gamble, a final, brutal winter offensive through a stretch of forested hills, rivers, and ravines along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. For most of the war, the Ardennes had been quiet, too dense for tanks, too cold for long campaigns. That was precisely why Hitler chose it. On December 16th, 1944, under the cloak of darkness and snow, over 200,000 German troops surged through the trees, ghostly columns of armor and infantry moving in eerie silence. They were backed by more than 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles, many bearing the Iron Cross of divisions that had once conquered half of Europe. Their goal was simple and terrifying: punch a hole through the Allied line, reach the Belgian port of Antwerp, and cut the British and American armies in two. If they succeeded, they could force a peace deal in the West, freeing the Wehrmacht to face the Soviets in the East. It was an audacious plan, fueled by secrecy, speed, and desperation. The German tanks carried just enough gasoline for a few days of advance. If they moved too slowly, if the weather turned, if their fuel ran dry, they would be stranded. They knew it. Everyone knew it. But they gambled everything on surprise. On the American side, panic rippled like shockwaves. Entire regiments were swallowed by confusion before they even knew they were under attack. Communication lines snapped. Villages disappeared beneath advancing columns. The already narrow roads became clogged with retreating civilians, with convoys trying to escape the storm, with trucks spinning helplessly on ice. In the chaos, another crisis began to emerge, one quieter, but just as deadly. The Allies were running out of fuel. Weeks earlier, their rapid push through France had stretched supply lines far beyond their limits. Trucks broke down by the hundreds. Storage depots were scattered, vulnerable, and thinly defended. The great machine that had driven the Allied advance was starting to sputter. Behind every tank, every jeep, every artillery gun, there was one indispensable element. Not courage, not leadership, not even firepower, but fuel. Without it, the entire army could be stopped cold. And when German units began targeting Allied fuel convoys, capturing some, burning others, the paralysis spread. Entire battalions were stranded. Tanks stood motionless in the snow, their crews helpless, their guns silent, because the trucks carrying their gasoline never came. That is where our story truly begins. Not on the front lines, but far behind them, in the cab of a single truck, driven by one man through a storm no sane soldier would enter. A man carrying nothing but fuel and faith through a landscape of confusion and danger. Whether he lived or died, whether he reached his destination or vanished into the blizzard, his choices would help decide the outcome of the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. The driver's name was John Miller. Everyone called him Jack. He was not a hero, not in his own eyes. He was a truck driver, one of tens of thousands, whose task was to move the lifeblood of war, fuel, food, ammunition, across roads that were often little more than shattered trails. Jack was 31. Before the war, he worked at a gas station in Pennsylvania. He knew the sound of an engine like some men know a heartbeat. He could tell when a truck needed oil just by the way it sighed when it idled, could sense a misaligned carburetor in the rhythm of its breath. When he joined the Army, that instinct earned him a place in the Motor Transport Corps, the invisible artery that kept the Allied body alive. From Normandy to the Siegfried Line, he had driven without rest for months. Across bridges that barely stood, through towns that no longer existed, past columns of smoke that reached the heavens, and faces that had forgotten how to hope. He had seen what war did, and still, he kept driving. Because he understood that every drop of fuel delivered meant one more chance for someone else to make it home. That December morning, when Jack received his order to deliver a full load of high-octane gasoline to an armored division near the town of Stavelot, he didn't hesitate. He checked his tires, cleaned his windshield, tightened his scarf. Twice. He knew how cruel the Ardennes wind could be. Then he climbed into his truck, turned the key, and listened as the engine came alive. A deep, steady growl that seemed to promise survival. The route was supposed to be simple. 3 hours, 2 checkpoints, 1 delivery. But nothing in war is ever simple. By then, the German offensive had already turned the map upside down. Road signs had been switched or stolen by enemy commandos disguised as American soldiers. Radio lines were jammed. Supply maps printed weeks earlier no longer matched the broken landscape outside. Jack didn't know that the town he was heading toward was already under siege. He just knew he had a job to do. So he shifted into gear. The truck lurched forward, its tires groaning against the ice, and soon the rhythm of the road filled the cab, the hum of chains, the hiss of snow, the faint rattle of fuel drums in the back. Snowflakes whipped against the windshield like sparks in the dark. He passed other trucks, some wrecked, some burned, others simply abandoned. The forest around him felt alive, whispering with wind and distant thunder from unseen artillery. Every few miles, he stopped to check his bearings, but the landmarks had vanished. Houses lay in ruins. The trees were splintered. The road signs that should have pointed him toward Stavelot pointed toward nothing at all. Still, he pressed on, because somewhere out there, men were waiting for this fuel. men who believed help was on the way. And as long as his engine turned and his heart still beat, Jack Miller would make sure they were right. He didn't know it yet, but his next decision, just one wrong turn, would make him part of history. At first, the road seemed familiar. He had driven through enough Belgian countryside to know a back road from a main supply route. But something was off. The trees pressed too close. The turns came too sharp. The silence felt too complete. He hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly 20 minutes. The storm was thick now, a wall of white swallowing the world. And still, Jack drove on, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness, the engine straining against the cold. The road wound deeper into the forest, narrower with every mile. He didn't realize it yet, but the road he was on no longer belonged to him, and somewhere ahead, history was waiting. The snow was falling harder now, thick, weightless flakes swirling like drifting smoke across the windshield, a dance of light and shadow under the trembling beam of the headlights. The wipers shrieked with each pass, scraping against glass already rimed with frost. Jack leaned forward, his face inches from the wheel, eyes straining to see through the storm. Every few seconds he blinked against the sting of snow that slipped through the crack of the window. He searched desperately for a sign, any sign, a road marker, a fence line, a bend he recognized, but there was nothing. The forest had swallowed everything. No houses, no fences, no chimneys breathing smoke into the frozen night. No fences meant no farms. And no farms meant he had gone too far, drifting away from the familiar arteries of Allied supply and into the deep, unmarked veins of the Ardennes. His heart began to sink. Jack slowed the truck, the tires crunching softly against the frozen road. He could hear the hum of the engine trembling beneath him, feel the vibration through the steering column, a heartbeat of steel and fire trying to hold its rhythm in the cold. He thought about turning back, but something inside him resisted. Maybe it was duty, maybe pride, maybe fear. He glanced at the fuel gauge. It hovered near full, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The irony struck him. This truck drank fuel faster than any tank he'd ever delivered to. And out here, in the wilderness, running out of gasoline wasn't just inconvenient, it was final. You didn't run out of fuel in the Ardennes. You froze where you stopped. He eased the truck to a stop near a bend where the trees pressed close together, climbed down, and stepped into the snow. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp, unrelenting, biting through his gloves in seconds. The air smelled of pine sap and distant smoke, like the ghost of a burned village carried on the wind. He unrolled his canvas map, laying it flat against the hood, weighing the corners with his elbows as the wind tried to tear it away. His gloved finger traced the black veins of roads and rivers, searching for one that matched what he saw around him. But the truth struck him like a punch to the gut. The road he was standing on wasn't on the map at all. He looked up slowly, staring down the long, empty corridor of snow-covered dirt. The storm muffled every sound, turning the world into a frozen void. That realization sank deep. He wasn't just off course. He was lost. And worse, he might be lost inside enemy territory. Jack turned his head toward the tree line, eyes scanning the dark for movement, for light, for anything that didn't belong. Then he walked slowly around to the back of the truck. He laid a gloved hand against the steel hull of the fuel tank. It radiated faint warmth through the metal, alive, almost pulsing, as if it were breathing. Behind that thin wall sat thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline, the exact thing the German panzers were running out of. If they found him, if even a single enemy patrol stumbled onto this lonely road, he knew what would happen. He wouldn't be taken prisoner. He'd be turned into a column of fire, a beacon in the snow. Jack closed his eyes. The snow landed on his lashes, melting into tiny drops of ice that ran down his cheeks. In that stillness, his mind began to race. Was this a trap road? Had German saboteurs switched the signs to lure Allied convoys astray? He'd heard the rumors that enemy soldiers were dressing in American uniforms, giving false directions, changing passwords, switching road markers. He remembered vividly, a week earlier, a soldier had been shot at a checkpoint for giving the wrong password. The image stuck in his mind, sharp as glass. He climbed back into the cab, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine coughed, then roared back to life, loud and alive, filling the silence with courage. He sat there, hands on the wheel, breathing hard. He had a choice now. Stay put and hope someone found him. Turn back and risk retracing roads that could already be compromised, or keep moving forward into the unknown. He stared through the frosted windshield and tapped the dashboard twice, as if speaking to an old friend. "Come on, girl," he murmured under his breath. "We're not done yet." He shifted into gear. The truck shuddered, then rolled forward into the dark, a road he could not name, toward a destination he could not see, carrying a cargo that could ignite half the forest if fate turned cruel. Behind him, the tire tracks vanished almost instantly under a fresh blanket of snow, as though he'd never been there at all. Ahead, the trees closed in. The night grew darker. The wind howled. He drove for what felt like forever, though it could have been minutes or hours. The road narrowed to little more than a trail. Branches leaned overhead like the ribs of a great beast, forming a tunnel of black wood and silver frost. Jack switched off the headlights. He couldn't afford to be seen. The darkness swallowed him whole. He drove by touch now, by instinct, by the faint red glow of a flashlight pressed between his knees, its weak beam just enough to show the next few feet of road. The silence was absolute. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that hums in your ears, that makes your breath sound too loud. The kind of silence that feels watched. Jack's pulse thudded against his ribs. He leaned forward again, eyes fixed ahead, every sense alert. Then, suddenly, movement. A flicker of light far ahead. Faint, yellow, trembling. He froze, killed the engine. The truck settled into stillness. The silence that rushed back in felt heavy enough to crush him. He stared at the distant glow through the swirling snow. Could be a campfire, could be a lantern, could be a German patrol, or maybe, it was American, a lost unit, an outpost, a miracle. He reached into the glove box and pulled out his sidearm, a standard issue Colt 45, cold metal, familiar weight. He had never fired it in combat. His breath fogged the window. 1 minute passed, then 2. The light flickered and vanished. He waited longer, heart hammering. Then from somewhere in the distance, so faint he almost doubted it, the low, guttural growl of an engine. Then another, deep, heavy, rolling like thunder. Tanks, he couldn't tell whose. The sound grew, then faded, then was gone. Jack exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a cloud. If those were German tanks, they were moving just as blind as he was, hunting in the dark. If they were American, he couldn't risk it either. Jittery soldiers in a night like this might fire first and ask questions never. He started his engine again, letting it rumble low before easing forward, headlights still off. The storm began to thin. The snow slowed just enough for the outline of the road to appear beneath the tires. The truck crept forward until Jack reached a junction, a fork splitting into 3 narrow paths. No signs, no tire tracks, nothing. He stopped again, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped into the cold. The snow crunched softly under his boots. He swung the light slowly across the trees. Then he saw it, a faint pattern beneath a layer of frost, painted on the trunk of a pine. He wiped it with his glove. The shape emerged, ghost-like beneath the ice. A white star. For a heartbeat, Jack just stared. The American star, faded, worn, but unmistakable. His pulse quickened. He He scraped the bark with his knife until the symbol was clear. It was old, but real. Someone had been here. Recently, maybe. But that was enough. Enough to believe he was still on the right side of the war. He made his choice. Middle road. Back in the cab, he turned the wheel slowly, easing the truck onto the center path. The wind howled through the trees, and the smell hit him before the sound. A faint scent of burned oil and exhaust. Something had been here recently, or was still here. He followed the scent. Every mile stretched thin, each bend in the road holding its breath. He passed wreckage, a truck overturned in a ditch, its wheels still spinning slowly in the wind. Another vehicle riddled with bullet holes, its cabin filled with snow, ghostly white. No bodies. That was somehow worse. The silence that followed made the skin between his shoulders crawl. Jack kept driving. The forest began to thin. The snow grew shallower. And then, after what felt like hours, though it had been maybe 30 minutes, he saw it. A flicker of shape and shadow. Barbed wire, stacked sandbags, the edge of a trench, half buried in snow. He braked gently. The truck hissed to a halt. Then, from the darkness ahead, a voice shouted, sharp, human, and American. "Halt! Password!" Jack's hands shot into the air. His voice came out hoarse, caught between fear and relief. "Philadelphia," he shouted. A pause. Then, "Advance and be recognized." Jack rolled forward slowly, his breath fogging the glass. A soldier emerged from the trench, snow clinging to his helmet. M1 rifle in hand, the man squinted into the headlights. "You're late," the soldier said, his voice flat with exhaustion. "We were about to give up on your convoy." Jack shook his head, still barely believing what he was seeing. "I'm not a convoy," he said quietly. "I'm just one truck." The man's eyes flicked to the back of the vehicle, to the fuel drums gleaming faintly in the half-light. "Is that what I think it is?" Jack nodded. "High octane. For the armor division. I got lost." The soldier let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Buddy, you have no idea what you just did." And Jack exhaled. Finally. The tension melted from his shoulders. He didn't know it yet, but his fuel had just reached the last American position still holding in that sector. Within an hour, those drums would be feeding into engines that hadn't roared in days, tanks buried in snow, waiting for a miracle. They moved quickly. As soon as Jack's truck rolled into the perimeter, men swarmed around it. Frostbitten hands gripped the steel handles of fuel drums, teeth clenched against the cold. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what was at stake. This outpost was the last thin wall before the crossroads of Trois Ponts. If it fell, the German armor would pour through, and the whole front might collapse. Jack stood by the truck, breath misting in the air, watching as the men worked under the frozen stars. The sound of fuel sloshing into metal cans echoed through the night, a steady rhythm of survival. And for the first time since he'd left the depot, Jack Miller smiled, because the fuel was where it needed to be. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. A single snowflake landed on the barrel nearest him, hissed and melted away. The tanks, mostly Shermans, hadn't moved in 36 hours. They sat like sleeping giants beneath a blanket of snow, their steel hides glazed with frost, their barrels tilted toward a sky the color of lead. Around them, the men huddled in foxholes or curled up in the shadows of their machines, rifles in hand instead of wrenches, waiting for either fuel or orders to retreat. Neither had come, not until now. Jack climbed down from the cab, his legs stiff, his face raw from wind and exhaustion. The cold bit deep, but he barely felt it anymore. What he did feel, what everyone felt, was the silence breaking as the first fuel lines were unrolled. Hoses hissed, metal fittings clanged, and then, one by one, the tanks began to stir. The pumps hummed, and the Shermans, dormant for 2 days, coughed, groaned, and came alive. It started with a single sputter, then a growl, then a full-throated roar as engines thundered back to life. The sound rolled through the forest like a storm breaking open the night. Black smoke curled from exhaust pipes and hung low in the frigid air. Turrets turned, gears whining. Machine gunners climbed into place, their gloved hands fumbling with frozen triggers. The entire outpost, moments ago silent as a graveyard, now trembled with motion. A young lieutenant approached Jack, his breath steaming in the cold, a clipboard trembling in his gloved hands. "You came alone?" he asked, disbelief mixing with fatigue. Jack nodded, the movement slow, almost apologetic. The officer blinked, glanced at the truck behind him, then back at the newly awakened Shermans rolling toward the tree line. "That's impossible," he whispered. But it wasn't. It had happened, and just in time. Within the hour, scouts reported that armored units from Kampfgruppe Piper, some of the most battle-hardened forces in the Wehrmacht, were advancing toward their position. They had already overrun Stavelot and left ruin in their wake. Now they were coming for the fuel, desperate, relentless, and unaware that the Americans had just refueled. The Shermans roared into motion, snow spraying from beneath their treads, their engines howling as they fanned out along the tree line. They took up ambush positions on the ridges, between pines blackened by smoke and shell fire. Then they waited. When the Germans arrived, expecting silence, expecting surrender, they met something else entirely. The first shell tore through the dawn like thunder splitting a mountain. Then another. The forest shook as American guns opened fire from every hill. Machine guns hammered. Tracers streaked across the snow like fiery comets. The enemy's advance faltered, then broke. Shock rippled through their lines, surprise giving way to confusion, confusion to panic. The fuel Jack had delivered gave those tanks motion. It gave them strength. It gave them the chance to fight. And in doing so, it denied the Germans what they needed most, fuel of their own. Hitler's entire gamble in the Ardennes had rested on speed, on momentum, on the relentless push of mechanized blitzkrieg. Without it, the attack would wither, and that day, it began to die. Historians later agreed that this small, forgotten engagement helped prevent Piper's spearhead from reaching the vital fuel depots near Trois-Ponts and Spa. Without that capture, their advance stalled. The German tanks, low on fuel, trapped by mud and snow, became steel coffins. Some crews abandoned them, others destroyed their own vehicles rather than leave them to the enemy. What had begun as a furious thrust into Allied lines slowed and then froze. Jack Miller never fired a weapon. He never gave a command. He hadn't meant to wander into history, but he had. The fuel he delivered, by mistake or by fate, kept an entire sector alive. That night, he slept in the cab of his truck, his breath misting the glass, the world outside lit faintly by the burning of distant villages. When he woke at dawn, an officer stood by the door, reaching out a hand. "You saved a battalion," the man said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He would never talk much about that day. After the war, he went home to Pennsylvania, married, had 2 sons, drove trucks again, this time for a hardware company instead of the army. The engines were quieter, the roads familiar, and the snow was just snow again. White, clean, harmless. He never asked for medals, never told his story in bars or parades. But the records are there. Fuel delivered, tanks refueled, a line held, and that, quietly, invisibly, helped turn the tide. By the morning of December 19th, 1944, Hitler's final offensive was already unraveling. It had started with fury, over 200,000 men, 1,000 armored vehicles, and the conviction that the Ardennes would fracture beneath German might. They struck like a hammer, and for a moment, it seemed they might break the Allied front in two. But a hammer, no matter how strong, is useless without a handle. Their handle, their logistics, their fuel was gone. For all their skill and discipline, for all the speed that defined the Blitzkrieg, the Wehrmacht had gambled everything on stolen gasoline. They had enough to reach Antwerp, but not enough to return. Their hope depended entirely on capturing Allied depots along the way. Depots now reinforced, guarded, and waiting. Depots defended because one lone driver had arrived before the storm. Without that fuel, the German spearhead began to sputter. Tanks froze in the snow. Engines died mid-road. Crews, shivering and starving, abandoned their machines and tried to press on by foot. Some blew up their own panzers to deny them to the enemy. By December 22nd, Kampfgruppe Piper, once the sharp edge of the offensive, was surrounded. They had run out of fuel, out of food, out of time. Over 100 tanks and armored vehicles were left behind. Piper himself escaped on foot, his men scattered through the woods. The dream of dividing the Allied armies was gone. Across the front, the Allies stiffened. Convoys like Jack's, quiet, unheralded, arrived. Artillery found its voice again. Tanks roared back to life. Paratroopers in Bastogne, who had held their ground in freezing isolation, could finally hear the rumble of engines bringing relief. The balance had shifted. By Christmas, the German advance had lost all momentum. The Great Offensive, Hitler's last, was collapsing under the weight of its own desperation. And in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, the final hope of the Reich froze beside its steel beasts. Part of that, just one, small, undeniable part, was a single truckload of fuel delivered by a man who never intended to be part of history. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a commander. He was simply a driver with frostbitten hands and a belief that the mission still mattered, even when nothing else made sense. That's the part history often forgets. Because when we talk about battles, we talk about arrows on maps, names of generals, treaties signed in marble rooms. But wars aren't won only by the ones giving orders. They're won by the ones who keep showing up. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't fought solely by heroes in command posts. It was fought by cooks stirring frozen rations, medics tending wounds in the dark, mechanics fixing engines with bleeding fingers, and fuel truck drivers who drove forward when every instinct screamed to turn back. Jack Miller was one of them, and while his name doesn't appear in strategy reports or textbooks, his legacy is written in the engines that turned over, the guns that fired, and the men who lived long enough to fight another day. Sometimes, war isn't won by grand strategy or sweeping heroism. Sometimes, it's won because one person refuses to stop moving. When the Battle of the Bulge finally ended in late January 1945, more than 1 million men had fought across the frozen heart of Belgium. 19,000 Americans never returned home. Nearly 50,000 were wounded, and 23,000 more were captured or vanished in the snow. It remains the costliest battle the U.S. Army ever fought. The world remembers Bastogne. It remembers Patton. It remembers the siege, the snow, the stubbornness. But few remember the fuel trucks. Fewer still remember the names of the men behind their wheels. Yet behind every victory, there are those shadows. The ones who pulled weight instead of triggers, who endured instead of charged, who never stood in front of cameras or saluted on parade grounds, but who changed the course of history through endurance alone. Jack Miller was one of those men. When he returned home in the spring of 1945, there were no banners, no reporters, no brass bands. He stepped off a train in Harrisburg, carrying a duffel bag and a limp in his right leg from weeks of cold exposure. His wife met him on the platform. He kissed her, held his newborn son for the first time, and said nothing about what he'd seen. A few weeks later, he was back behind a steering wheel, just another driver on another road. For decades, he never told the story, not out of secrecy or shame, but simply because no one asked. To him, it had been a bad night in a snowstorm, a wrong turn, a delivery that got there late, but he had kept going. and that was enough. Maybe that's what heroism really is. Not medals or speeches, but persistence when the road disappears beneath you. Years later, when his grandson asked him about the war for a school project, Jack finally told it. The snow, the wrong road, the trench, the password. The boy, eyes wide, had asked softly, "Did you know you were saving people?" Jack had smiled. "I just knew they were waiting," he said. That was all. No drama, no embellishment, just truth. And maybe that truth is what keeps his story alive. Because wars aren't won only by heroes. They're won by people who keep their promises, who keep the engine running even when they can't see the road, who deliver what matters when it matters most. The forgotten soldiers are not truly forgotten, not as long as we remember what they stood for, what they carried, and what they refused to abandon. Even in the darkest nights of war, Jack wasn't alone. There were thousands like him, mechanics working barehanded in freezing wind, cooks heating food on shattered stoves, medics crawling through snow to reach the fallen, clerks typing supply lists under candlelight. They were the heartbeat of the army, the quiet pulse behind every victory. So, when we speak of the Battle of the Bulge, let's not only remember the commanders and the battlefields, but also the drivers in the dark, the ones who got lost and kept going. Because sometimes, saving the world doesn't come from glory. It comes from endurance. Jack wasn't a hero because he got it right. He was a hero because even when he got it wrong, he didn't stop. That's the paradox of courage. Sometimes the road that saves the world is the one you were never meant to take. There is no statue of Jack Miller, no plaque by that frozen road. The drums are gone, the tanks he saved rust quietly in museums, and the men he reached have grown old or slipped into memory. But his story remains, not carved in stone, but carried in principle. What about you? If you were in that cab, cold, lost, and afraid, would you have stopped? Would you have turned back? Or would you have kept driving into the dark? Because sometimes history doesn't need a hero. It just needs someone who refuses to stop.